Welcome to Athletes on Balance, where we talk to athletes, coaches, and experts about mental health and sports. This is a stigma-free zone for inner thoughts and outer conversations. We're helping athletes and anyone with mental health challenges perform at their best, on and off the field.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Athletes on Balance. I'm your host, Walt Norley, the founder and CEO of On Balance Health. Today, I'm joined by Julie Kliegman, the copy chief at Sports Illustrated, a position she's held since 2020. During her tenure at SI, she's published numerous articles focused on mental health and sports. Julie recently wrote a book titled Mind Game, an inside look at the mental health playbook of elite athletes, which is set to be released in March of 2024. Is that correct, Julie? Next March?
Yep.
Mm-hmm. She was kind enough to share the copy of the manuscript with me, which I read on my plane ride last night, Julie, just so you know. And from what I've read so far, it's excellent. I can relate to it. I highly recommend pre-ordering yourself a copy of this book before it comes out in March. I think it's a great resource for athletes, coaches, administrators, care provider, anybody in that ecosystem. Prior to her work at SI, Julie was a copy editor at The Ringer, a publication focused on sports and pop culture. She also held roles at The Week, BuzzFeed, Tampa Bay Times, and PolitiFact. Some of her other work has appeared in The Washington Post, Vulture, The Verge, I think, and Washington Monthly. Julie's a graduate of Northwestern and lives in New York. If you'd like to learn more about her work, you can visit her website, juliekliegman.com. She also has a newsletter, Mental Notes, where she writes about mental health in sports and provides updates on the upcoming publication of her book. I've mentioned this many times before. Mental health is very important to me. I have managed a bipolar disorder for more than 4 decades in my business life and perhaps back in my playing days as a quarterback at Ohio State and Georgia. It's a personal mission of mine to improve the quality of care for athletes and eliminate all the stigmas that are associated with mental health. It's long overdue. Julie, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Yep, this is exciting. Over the last few years, you have been one of the leading voices in the sports media world who covers mental health, and you've inspired the decision to make mental health a focus within your work. In the introduction of the book, you mentioned struggling with depression yourself and being diagnosed with bipolar 2. And which I can relate to. Your book is great and has great insights throughout. What was the main reason that you wrote this book?
Yeah, I think I just wanted to see it in the world because it's something that athletes are talking about more and more. And it's been so, nice to hear that, not that they're struggling, but that they finally feel comfortable opening up about their struggles. And, I think it's important for someone to chronicle that.
You've probably done hundreds of interviews, including for your book.
Yes.
Looking at these interviews from a high view, from a macro view, have you noticed any themes or trends that have been happening for mental health within the sports world?
I think overall things are trending upward. Athletes are more likely to say that they have support from their coaches, their teammates, people in their personal lives, from mental health professionals assigned to teams. And increasingly, as you know, I'm sure there are mental health professionals assigned to teams, whereas before there really weren't. In most sports. And so that's one trend I see. The other trend is that, they're just more comfortable stepping forward. And I think it goes back to the other reason that they have these support systems in their lives that enable them to feel comfortable doing so.
So to your point, there seems to be athletes from a variety of sports coming out, it almost seems, per week, right, on a challenge that somebody had. They had to stop competition because of it. They're taking a mental health break. You kind of just touched on it. I mean, why are athletes more willing to share today than they were, I don't know, 5 years ago? It's not that long ago, right? I mean, it's not like it's 20 years ago. It's really the last 5 years. I mean, what's allowed that?
I think some big names coming forward has certainly helped. I mean, I think Michael Phelps in particular, one of the greatest athletes of all time, I think. And once someone like him with his accolades comes forward, I think that enables other people to feel that security in coming forward, say, okay, if we can accept Michael, we can accept others as well. And and it also does go back to what I said earlier about just feeling more secure, in your environment with the people around you being supportive. Also, I think there are increasingly a number of ways to come forward. It used to just have to be in a press conference, right? And now we have social media, we have outlets like the Players Tribune. We have all these different ways that athletes can choose to come forward in the way that they're comfortable with.
Well, to that point, yeah, there's different media outlets, but the media, you're in several sectors of the media, at least by my classification. But you have a mainstream media outlet, obviously, within Sports Illustrated. In other words, it's a broad, leadership for decades. Why is the media has also embraced this, right? The media is not judgmental about this as well. Where does that come from? From maybe 10 years ago, where the media might have had criticism to somebody talking about this?
Yeah, I think it's a great observation. It's been really transformed in such a short period of time. And I think part of that, if I had to guess, would be people in the media's own lives, whether they themselves have been struggling or they know other people who have been. I think the pandemic probably accelerated things a bit because so many people struggled with mental health issues during the pandemic, even people who never had before. And I think it just cultivates that sense of empathy in the media.
So it's relatable, people
Yes.
can relate to it. Yeah. I mean, people in the media and families and friends and colleagues. I mean, it's going to work and it's struggling with the stress and, the isolation and the unknowns and so forth. So why would an athlete be any different, right?
Right.
Let's talk a little bit about the future, because you do touch upon this as well in your book. And I'm in the technology business, so I love this actually. So I've read about Aaron Rodgers' experience with ayahuasca. Did I pronounce that right, by the way? Is that ayahuasca?
Ayahuasca.
Yeah. So I'm familiar with it in Peru and the root and positive outcomes that it had for him. Last August, you published a piece about psychedelics used by some athletes. It was titled, "What do athletes get from ayahuasca, mushrooms, and ecstasy?" Is that correct? Is that the name?
Yeah.
It was an interesting article, and based on your research and some of the stuff you did interview-wise, do you think psychedelics in a controlled environment are a legitimate treatment for athletes that are suffering or being challenged by a level of mental health?
I think they certainly could be. I don't think we know enough quite yet for me to be able to say with 100% confidence that they are. But as research moves along for different psychedelics and different situations, I think we've seen some promising results. I don't think psychedelics are going to be for everybody. For you and I, for example, although we're not athletes at the moment, at least professionally, with bipolar disorder, I don't think that's ever going to be an effective treatment there in all likelihood.
I've read that actually.
Yeah, but for people with depression, it might be a really good solution. Assuming that there's a therapy component involved, that the therapy is somewhat regulated itself, we've seen exciting results so far.
John Hopkins has been a leader doing research in it, and I think Columbia as well has been a leading. They're doing a lot of clinical trials. But do you think sports, I mean, really it's an alternative from the pharmaceutical world. to treat this, right? I mean, that's what this is. They're trying to make this an evolution of treatment for depression, substance abuse. Where do you think that the athletic world, whether it's collegiate or professional, will be an early adopter of a new methodology, or would they be, post general public?
I'm not sure if they'd be an early adopter just because athletes are so necessarily careful about what they put in their bodies. And also because of different leagues' regulations around substances. So I don't think they're necessarily an early adopter, but I think they'll come along, especially because there are a lot of athletes who might be resistant to traditional psychiatric medication because of the stigma associated with it. But psychedelics, I think, just appeals to a different group of people. So I think athletes will be interested.
Well, then you have the side effects that come with certain, depressant treatments, et cetera.
Right.
Well, just again to stay on, the alternative treatment methodology. What have you heard, and what perspective do you have on cannabis for athletes?
Yeah, I think it's something that has become obviously less stigmatized. Again, very, very quickly. A lot of changes in general in the mental health space for athletes have happened so quickly. We saw when Shakari Richardson was disqualified and she revealed that, she had taken cannabis. We saw her not universally embraced, but certainly embraced by a large section of the public and even the media.
Right.
So I think experts would still caution that cannabis isn't necessarily like effective for performance, but or for mental health purposes in general, but it's certainly become less of like a problem for, people who do seek out cannabis.
I think I've read that there are, I don't know if it's the NFL, maybe, don't quote me on this, but one of the professional leagues are not testing as randomly as they did, or as frequently as they did for cannabis, within the bloodstream. Staying with the future. I'm in the technology business. AI is being integrated to just about every facet of our society and our life. How do you think AI can affect or benefit athletes when it comes to improved mental health care?
Yeah, well, this is something that honestly you probably know more about than I do, but I will say that like tracking patterns and stuff in behavior could be huge for helping monitor athletes and helping them out. As long as the machine learning aspect doesn't overtake like the human side of that direct interaction, that direct connection between professionals and athletes, I think AI could be really helpful in helping us detect patterns in behavior.
Well, and I think you hit it on the nail on the head. That the metrics, as you know, exist in every form of athletics for physical performance, athletic performance, right? Speed, strength, thrust, vertical, hamstring strength, hand-eye coordination. I mean, we deal with it within our business, with integration of those performance characteristics. Data. It's data, right? And the data has trends that go with it, right? You get a baseline, and from the baseline, you look at somebody's hamstring strength either increase or decrease, right? So
Right.
Bringing AI into it's a different world, as you know, Julie, because the brain is not monitored like an MRI or an X-ray or blood work, right? It's
Right.
there's a subjectiveness that comes with mental health diagnosis that really doesn't exist on the physical side. But to your point, using AI with facial expressions and some of the amazing things that are happening right now. Can it lead to looking at trends and therefore maybe predictors, and then purely athletically, can you take that and create an intersection between the behavioral mental elements as well as the physical and the athletic? I mean, have you run across this within your world that people are looking into this, or any professional sports or collegiate sports organizations?
I've certainly seen some papers on it in the academia world. I have not really yet had any conversations about AI with different teams or leagues, but I'm sure they're looking into it. I mean, we've seen people looking into AI in basically every industry.
Right, right. Well, let's talk about, and you write about it, and I actually really enjoyed this part of what I've read, how people talk about mental health in sports, right? When an athlete loses, a game, a competition, obviously it's difficult, but you have other things that have been just talk about a pylon. There's criticism that it's always been there from the mainstream media, but now you have that plus fan bases that are exposed to social media. It seems like society kind of forgets, athletes are, human beings as well, right? And the criticism has a negative effect. What's your perspective on that and how that's kind of snowballed?
I think we're so conditioned to see athletes as superheroes. And I think, yeah, at the end of the day, they're just people, right? But when we put them on this pedestal, not only for their athletic achievements, but for their mental toughness or their resiliency, I think it creates this issue where athletes do feel like they don't have the space to say they're struggling. But when we are able to grant them that humanity, and realize that they're just like us, they're just like you, me, our family members, our friends, I think that's game changing.
To the media's credit, I mean, whether it's an ESPN story or whatever other outlet. I mean, there's a lot more storytelling about that than there was in yesteryear. I mean, you're doing quite a bit about that. I mean, last summer you focused on the difference between mental toughness. Well, actually mental toughness and how it's been used by the media, and the difference between that phrase back in my day, which was get back in the what huddle, or you got your bell rang and somebody'd come out and say with three fingers and you say four and they say close enough, get back in, right? So what
Right.
what is your interpretation of that phrase, and can it be rephrased?
Yeah, so mental toughness is actually something that researchers disagree about the definition of all the time. So it's hard to blame the public or coaches or athletes for not having one consistent way of thinking about it. But one of the experts I've talked to has described it as a mental toughness as a resource that gives you the skills to fight adversity from point A to point B. And that's in like a big picture sense of like, say it's your goal to get to the Olympics. Do you have the mental toughness to get there? Obviously in addition to the physical prowess.
Right.
And so I think that there's not necessarily an issue with the definition itself. It's more just that the media and coaches don't always understand that definition, right? And so in misusing it, you could compliment athletes, like, as you said, for, playing through a concussion or something like that, when that's not the actual intended meaning of mental toughness.
It's where the line is, right? So where is that line? Because personally, I think that mental strength. I'll use the word mental strength, right? I think part of mental health, for whatever line of work you're in, or what you're trying to achieve, certainly in athletics, I think mental strength is important, right? I mean, the ability to work through, having a tough day and not feeling like you want to go at 100 miles an hour. I mean, the capacity to do that, but the line. Just like I used this before, I mean, if you've got a knee that's banged up, but not to the point where you can't play and you can't perform, but it hurts, right? You've got some discomfort down there. Athletes are taught to play through that, right? But the difference is when there's something torn and it's swollen up, and there's kind of no way you can compete. Well, what do? You go get treatment, right? So go to the mental side of it. That line between pushing through and you've got a real issue. You really have depression going on. You really have another level of anxiety going on, right? So how do you delineate that from a media standpoint? Because you just made the point. It really comes down to the coaches and the people that are around that athlete. Because
Right.
we've all seen articles where, somebody's really being called out for not being on the field, and somebody else had a similar situation, and they're on the field. Why is one
Right.
athlete, in competition, and one athlete with a similar symptom not on, in competition?
Yeah, I think it's really tricky, and I think it comes down to everyone has their own personal boundaries, both physically and mentally. Obviously you could see people play through a knee injury that other people wouldn't be able to, and I think that's just fine. Everyone has a different pain tolerance, for
Right.
example,
Right.
and I think the same is true mentally. I mean, I've talked to athletes who playing exacerbates their anxiety, for example. I've also talked to athletes where playing minimizes their anxiety, and that's where they feel most at home is on the court or the field. So it's really different, but I think there is a point for everyone where mental illness becomes debilitating. It's not the same point for everybody, but it exists. Like if you're having trouble functioning, I talked to an athlete last year, Tyrell Terry, an NBA player who walked away at a really young age from the game. And, he was saying that he was having so much anxiety that he was throwing up before every time he had to go to the court. And that I think we can probably all agree that that's not a functional level, that's not a livable, sustainable symptom to play through.
No, it's not. But I mean, and again, unfortunately, it's to some extent, it's the evolution of training and nutrition that happened from 10 years ago, 30 years ago, et cetera. More knowledge, more science, more openness about this. Changes what you would do physically. So if that's the case physically, why wouldn't that be the case from a mental perspective in terms of playing and playing through type things? I've touched on your book several times, and I'd like to circle back for a second. In the introduction of your book, you explain, which I was getting ready to say, how mental health, quote unquote, is often used versus, mental illness.
Right.
Can you take us through your explanation and what you've learned on the difference of those two terms?
Yeah. So everyone has mental health. I'm sure everyone listening to this podcast has heard that phrase before. Everyone has mental health.
Right.
And I think that can be really useful to remember that it's not only people who are struggling who need to take care of their mental health and who need to keep an eye on that. But sometimes mental health is used as like a euphemism for mental illness. And I find that a little bit troubling because as a journalist, as someone who works with words all the time, I am in support of calling mental illness or anything what it is. And that's the first step to addressing it, right? Is, identifying the problem you're dealing with. And so I think just saying mental health kind of sanitizes the issue, if that makes sense. And so they are two different terms distinctly. And, I also talk about mental performance and sports psychology. And those are also things that everyone can benefit from in taking care of their brain and their mindset. But they're not all interchangeable terms.
Well, I tell you, I couldn't agree more. I mean, you have clinical knowledge, right, which allows you, from a media perspective, to delineate, the term, which is very general, mental health, right? That's become, but I hate to say, but it's almost become a pop term, right?
Yeah.
Generationally, it's almost everything's mental health. I'm having, I need to take care of my mental health, and I'm not belittling that. I believe in it, but that's a big umbrella, right? It's a very big umbrella. When you go into mental illness, as you know, it's then you're talking about clinical. What's the difference between
Right.
an episodal situation where you have a loss of a loved one, you lose in athletics, you lose the starting job, you get injured or you have a surgery, and you don't feel like you're part of the team, and to me, well, not to me, to the psychiatric community, or psychology community, that's an episodal environmental situation that can be treated, right, and can have a resolvement outcome, as opposed to your point with mental illness, a bipolar disorder, clinical depression, clinical anxiety, suicidal ideations, that, substance abuse, eating disorders, et cetera, right? And they're disorders that don't have a resolution, but
Right.
they can be managed and they can be treated, right? So, and your work out there delineating that, I think is great, so that people do understand the difference between that big umbrella world and what can be environmental compared to what's really a clinical defined diagnosis. So, you just have all this knowledge. I mean, do you feel like you're a little bit of a unicorn within the media world, writing about this intersection between, elite athletes and their mental well-being?
I think there are a lot of people doing good work in this space, but probably what's unique is like the degree to which I'm obsessed with thinking about it and writing about it. Yeah, it's hard. I think in the media nowadays, we all have to be generalists in some sense. And I write about other issues too, but this is one that I just keep coming back to and coming back to. And part of that is my position is to be an editor and not a writer. So when I do write, I can kind of pick and choose my spots as opposed to having to cover a day-to-day story about, say, the Chicago Bulls, right? I can just kind of swoop in and say, oh, there's an athlete who's struggling. I wonder if they have a story that they've been dying to tell.
Well, you've done a remarkable job in that regard. It's
Thank
what you
you.
just described, kind of as the difference between a play-by-play and somebody on the color side of a broadcast.
Right.
So you've had a strong pursuit to create awareness, and I believe similar to what my philosophy and why we're doing this is, the pursuit of destigmatizing this, right, through education, facts as opposed to perceptions, right?
Right.
How do we keep that train moving? How do we keep that dialogue, front and center?
Yeah, I think it's as simple as, well, nothing's simple, but I I think it's about the media continuing to find these stories and telling them in empathetic ways, in ways that talk not only about the struggle athletes face, but also the solutions in front of them and what it looks like to manage these conditions and, live fulfilling lives. So I think that's one component where the media can step in. I think the public really just needs to keep listening and really hearing what athletes are saying and not criticizing or questioning them when they say they're struggling with mental illness. Something I address later on in the book is that, there's some athletes who we just accept they're having mental health struggles, and there are others who for some reason we think they might be lying or doing it to get more money or and I think part of the public coming along is just accepting that, like, you don't get to pick and choose which stories you believe. If you believe one athlete, why aren't you believing the next?
No, and I saw you touch on that. I did. I read that piece. I think it was with the tennis player, and it was with Simone Biles a little bit. And the treatment they got compared to some other athletes, that had issues and really a biasness. Obviously this Athletes on Balance podcast is awareness, trying to eliminate the stigma, bringing in progressive coaches, mental health experts, athletes, people that have a strong platform like yourself. I have a perspective, but I'd like to hear yours. How do you think this resonates with people that aren't athletes?
In terms of the mental health stories?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of, do you think it has an impact on their perspective for their world as opposed to just the athletes?
I would like to think so. I would like to think, there are qualities in these stories that everyone can relate to. But if anything, it's like sometimes people are like, oh, well, why should I care about an athlete struggling? They have all this money, they have all this fame, they have all this talent.
Right.
But I do think that people, in their better moments can kind of like look at these athletes and take away, well, here's someone I look up to struggling. Maybe that impacts the struggle in my own life in a positive way. So, I didn't write the book, or I don't write these stories just for athletes or for people who are sports fans even. I write them for everybody.
Let me ask you a question that I ask all my previous guests, and it's one of my favorites. Is you have a great body of work, and you've made an impact. I mean, you're not that just writing about a sport and how they played isn't important, or how they competed isn't important, but you've taken it to another level, and I think you're really pioneering that. So within that journey, who has been the person most influential to you in your life?
Oh man. See, I don't even know if it's like other media members so much as the athletes I grew up watching. I think the people who got me to care about sports are some of the most inspirational in my life. I grew up watching the U.S. women's national team in soccer, and the 99ers are, some of my favorite athletes of all time. Mia Hamm, Julie Foudy, Brianna Scurry, Brandi Chastain. And then on the tennis side of Venus and Serena Williams, I also grew up, loving to watch. And I think that's what really got me to where I am today, is like cultivating that love of sports first. And then, once you love something, you can really start to see it in a more critical way too. And, not poke holes in it, but just like see it in a more nuanced light. And because you love something, try to point out the flaws in the systems that you're seeing in play.
Well, that's a great answer. It's an interesting answer, and I would tell you that's probably relatable for a lot of people, including myself. In terms of, well, you obviously took it to a different level, right? Some people have that inspiration of a great athlete or a team or whatever it may be, but you took it to the level. You've made you have a living. You have a living doing this, and it became a passion. Well, it was great having you here today. I'm a new fan of your work, and I'll be reading, everything you write now. I plan to jump on your website as well. Best of luck with your book. I can't wait to get a copy of it in March, and I hope everybody, as I said earlier, does a pre-order. I think it's it's pioneering work, and it's extremely important in our world right now, especially if you're a sports and a fan of athletes. And you're doing what we're trying to do, and that's raise awareness and destigmatize things in mental health. Thanks for your work. I look forward to reading more. Finally, I'd like to thank our followers. We appreciate you watching and listening. We're working hard towards creating greater awareness and eliminating this stigma. Be well, everybody. I'm Walton Orley, and this is Athletes on Balance.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Athletes on Balance. If you enjoyed what you heard today, please follow us on your preferred podcast app to catch our next episode. Join our community by sharing with an athlete, mental health care provider, or coach in your circle.